Thank you, Becky. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. So my name's Andrew, this is Landon, we're from Imperial, and our purpose here today is not really to share any specific design project, but to hopefully start a conversation at a sort of nexus between music and some recent directions in HCI research which have come to be called entanglement HCI. Now, just as fair warning, there's going to be a lot of theory in a very short period of time, and we'll do our best and happy to share some slides afterwards, and hopefully we start some conversations. We're working at the Augmented Instruments Lab. If you want to find more about what the lab's research is, you can have a look at instrumentslab.org. And the entry point to this talk is around musical instruments. Actually a complicated term because it depends on who you talk to. An engineer will tell you that a musical instrument is a transducer. It converts actions into sounds. A psychologist might tell you that an instrument is better understood as a kind of mediator, something that shapes perception and action. Whereas the ethnomusicologist will tell you that an instrument can only be understood as a product of and a shaper of a particular social and cultural context. Now, all of these perspectives are simultaneously valid, and I'm interested in the interrelationships between them, but actually especially a kind of around the turn from the ecology back to the transduction. In other words, if I sit down as an instrument designer, as an engineer, I sit down at the lab bench, I write some code, I build some circuits. What am I supposed to do differently because of all this heady theory around entanglements and ecologies and the kind of myriad webs of relationships? This is actually, I think, a very important question because as Frauenberger writes in this paper around entanglement HCI, the extent to which digital technology shapes who we are means that whoever shapes technology puts the chisel on humanity. A way of looking at this in the musical world is to say that instrument design is also instrumentalist design. We are essentially co-constituting people and cultures as well as systems. This is an important position of responsibility to be thinking about. That basic idea is what underlies a 5-year project which has just started this year called RUDIMENTS, an ERC-funded project which Landon and I, together with some others, are working on in the Augmented Instruments Lab. And our tools on this project fall under the umbrella of what Chris Frauenberger calls entanglement HCI. It's a kind of motley crew of sort of post-humanist theories and relational ontologies. And what do I mean by these things? Well, in a sense, I'm suggesting that we cannot study things in isolation, not because it's too difficult, but because actually things literally don't exist in isolation. It's actually a very strong ontological claim, which is essentially that the identity of everything is essentially dependent on its relationship to everything else. Without going into a great deal of detail, there's a number of different theories and philosophies that underpin this. One of them that's been particularly influential for us is Karen Barad's agential realism, and these are neatly summarized in Frauenberger's entanglement HCI paper. Some implications of this is that entanglement theory tends to reject dualisms, for example, nature versus culture, mind versus body, the intentional mind of the designer versus the inert substrate of matter that they shape their intentions through. Some entanglement theories, especially Barad's, also reject notions of representationalism, the idea that words and scientific measurements are somehow representations of a pre-existing underlying reality, but rather that all of these things are sort of co-constituted in what Barad calls a material discursive practice. Again, this gets fairly heavy fairly quickly. I'll turn it over to Landon in a second, but just to say that I think intuitively musicians actually already think along these lines. The performer of an instrument is really familiar with the sense that the instrument is not separate from the body, but actually part of oneself. You can think through it to the music that you want to make. And Simon Waters has written a very nice paper around musical entanglements, talking about how instruments are not objects, but processes, and that it's perhaps more productive to be thinking about not designing technical systems, but designing contexts for musicking, to use Christopher Small's term. Over to you.
All right, so as Andrew said, I'm Landon Morrison. I'm coming to the RUDIMENTS project from music, media, and cultural studies. So I've been spending the last 4 years teaching music theory. I bring a slightly different perspective to the question that Andrew just posed, this idea of how do ecological approaches affect design practices? Here, I'm interested in how they might affect music research. So in other words, the way that we might analyze musical text, the way we might historicize different communities of practice, the way we might theorize the relationship of various actors. And I want to do a quick inversion. So if Andrew shared a quote by Frauenberger, which was about technology putting the chisel on humanity, I want to kind of flip that around with a Gilbert Simondon quote. This is a philosopher, mid-century philosopher of technology, who says what resides in the machine is human reality. It's human gesture fixed and crystallized into working structures. So if designers are chiseling humanity, then the designers are also themselves being designed, I think would be the point here. They are also sort of in the wash of cultural forces. So what does this mean in the context of rudiments? I'm interested in following this line of thought and tracing the way that human gestures get, for instance, encoded in ergodynamics, the kind of body techniques that instruments afford, or even the way that perception and cognition models of hearing might get embedded in AI music software, for instance. So a quick lit review from my end of things on this idea of entanglement. So there's a lot of resonance between this concept and existing music, media, and cultural studies discourse. I want to just pinpoint a few here. I'm going to fly through these, but feel free to snap a picture if you want to follow up or ask questions later. The first here would be new organology. This is a general a sort of impetus towards the study of instruments as epistemic things, the idea that they're not just material objects, but that they encode ways of knowing sound, ways of interacting with sound, historical theories of sound. You've seen that on the music theory, the musicological, and ethnomusicological fronts. Software studies. People like Georgina Bourne have been writing about this for literally decades now in the context of music software. More recently, media studies scholars like Wendy Chun have talked about the kind of ideological effects of interfaces, which I'll come back to momentarily. Jonathan Stern in the sound studies world talking about format theory, things like the MIDI format or like the MPEG MP3 format, the way that they encode particular classification schemes and ways of talking about sound. Spanning off from there, infrastructure studies, I think, is a big component of this, has a lot to offer, both information infrastructures, the politics of classification schemes, like we see in Bowker and Starr, as well as these sort of material signal networks that Lisa Parks and Nicole Starosielski talk about. From this and related, political economy from Marxist traditions as well as political ecology. Kyle Devine in particular has written a book called Decomposed. It's really following musical media, things like records and tapes, both as they're manufactured and distributed, but also as they end up in the waste fields, right, in the dustbin. People like Eric Drott and Samantha Gopinath as well, writing sort of value chain analysis of music electronics and components. And then finally, I just want to sort of gesture toward a whole kind of diaspora of social studies of science thought. I've listed a handful of these. They all have their kind of alphabetic acronyms. All of these are somehow, I think, in the orbit of entanglement theory. But a slight pushback here, and I think this is important because entanglement has this kind of all-encompassing ambiance to it, the idea that everything is connected to everything else. It can turn into a totalizing term, I think, if we're not a little bit careful. So I do want to be careful to sort of say that entanglement is associated with a particular school of philosophy, new materialism. In particular, it's associated with this idea of a philosophy physics, the idea that social theories are grounded somehow in the hard stuff of matter, right? This is something I think we probably diverge and are still discussing amongst ourselves through a kind of diffraction of our own disciplinary backgrounds. But just to sort of lay out a few of these, I'll bullet point these. Entanglement and new materialism have had their share of back and forths with social construction of technology, in particular Trevor Pinch and Brad have gone back and forth. Object-oriented ontology, which is much less apolitical than a lot of new materialism. Even though some of the authors like Barad are coming from feminist technoscience, there are differences between them and feminist and queer theory. Sarah Ahmed, for instance, has leveraged a fairly trenchant critique in this regard. And finally, critical race studies and post-colonial studies have often found themselves sort of in the broil of debates with new materialism. So I'll go ahead and hand this back for a series of short provocations.
Right. We will try to keep this short. I want to suggest a sort of provocation around how entanglement theories challenge a familiar way of working that we have in designing digital musical instruments. It's a thing I tend to call design by analysis. It goes like this. I want to make an instrument to make music. What do I mean by music? Well, I have maybe in mind a particular style of music, a particular context. Maybe it's an unnoticed value judgment. The problem starts here. I go searching around for words that I have about music, concepts, things that I think describe music. And I organize those concepts into some kind of conceptual space. And I potentially assign numbers to these words. And what I end up with is a dimension space. So, maybe I'm talking about keyboard music. I think those are things that describe keyboard music. And I say, I'm not going to be limited to that. I'm going to think about timbre. I'm going to think about spatialization. I'm going to think about different audio effects. Implicit in this is the idea that making music potentially consists of a navigation of this dimension space. Does it? Well, analytically, I'm not sure. But here's the other thing that happens. Now I go to my toolbox. Good, I got some sensors, I got some FSRs, I've got some accelerometers, I've got a programming language. Great. I can use these to make a different numerical dimension space. Now, job's easy now. I get to assign relationships between the space of gestures and the space of sonic parameters. This is a familiar process to most people in this field. It's what we call mapping. My suggestion is that essentially mapping is a form of representation design. Why is this a problem? Well, so Philip Agri, who is an AI scientist turned STS scholar, talks about how computers are representational artifacts in the sense that designers of any computing system start by making representations of situations and activities, and his critique is basically that computing tends to reconfigure everything it touches into that form. And I would suggest that something similar goes on here with musical practice. We're starting with attempting to represent music, but what we're actually doing is the inverse. We are actually reinventing music to fit the representation that we created a priori. In other words, the sort of key ideological decision in this process is not what maps to what. It's creating the spaces in the first place. What did we prioritize? What did we make explicit? And this is a choice. We don't have to do things this way. I think the other thing that we don't have to do necessarily is agree with the notion that the machine has to encode a kind of music theoretic understanding of what it's doing that matches our understanding of what we do when we play it. Over to you.
All right, so I'll keep this one brief. So here we're talking about mapping, and with this slide I just want to suggest that this is in line with people like Wendy Chun, that any kind of mapping is always also a being mapped, right? So she puts this in terms of ideological critique, saying that ideology as false consciousness or ideology as fetishist logic, in both cases, interfaces seem to concretize our relationship to the invisible sources or substructures. So things like keyboards, the way that they create an invisible link between the user and 12-tone equal temperament, for instance, or drum machines and their link to an invisible source of metric hierarchies in Western classical music, for instance. These create sort of invisible links between the user and the technology and the systems that those technologies are representing. So this brings up this question of pseudo-individualization. And this is a concept that I'm borrowing from Theodor Adorno. It basically has to do with this idea that the user may feel that they are expressing themselves, but in fact, what they are expressing is somewhat vicarious through the affordances of the machine, right? So that the representation has pre-baked or pre-digested the scope of expressivity for the user in this case. So you can get bound up in this ideological loop. It's a bit scary, and you can maybe look for the exits, right? And try to find a way outside of the loop. And I want to make sure that I'm clear that this is not, I think, what I'm suggesting is even a possibility, this idea of getting outside one's own frame of reference. And rather than that sort of view of the totality, I want to borrow from a popular movie as of late, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I want to twist that into something somewhere in a gradual fashion. And I want to do this by drawing on Donna Haraway's idea that we need to relinquish notions of objectivity that are bound up in what she calls the God trick, this idea of seeing everything from nowhere, the view from nowhere. And rather, we need to be practicing something that's more like a partial perspective of situated knowledge. And so I'll turn it back over to you for the end here.
I think we probably don't have the time to get into this in great detail, but the big question here is more or less like this. Okay, so what? It's a lot of theory, it's a lot of references, blah, blah, blah. Why not just throw in the towel? Say, it's a bunch of fancy words. That was nice, back to our familiar design practices. Let's do exactly the same as we did before. Or kind of end up in this nihilist sort of loop where you say, well, how can we design anything at all when everything is so fundamentally flawed and entangled with everything else and has all these particular ideologies embedded in it? And so I think the best thing that we could say is maybe to engage in a certain kind of conversation. And this is maybe partly what Agrig calls the critical technical practice. 1 foot in the reflexive, 1 foot planted in the craft work of design, the other foot planted in the reflexive work of critique. So how do we do this? I don't know. Let's start a conversation. That's what we're here to do. We're not about solving problems here. We're not going to solve music. Let's talk. Thank you for your attention. Ironically, we've left no time for questions. How's that for starting a conversation? If you know anyone who wants to do a PhD or a postdoc on this topic in the lab, come talk to me.
Time for one question. Has anyone got a pressing question that they want to ask?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Landon, for a brilliant talk. And it's great to see the beginnings of rudiments, and I think our community will really benefit from your exploration. So since you're at the beginning, we're not going to be too hard on you for the questions, but indeed, I think what Landon did to say that not everything is from the same theoretical school is important, so that we don't mix up the Barads and the Latours. But also, I was interested in the agar and the mapping, in that things are constituted historically, politically, culturally, and that gives us a base of operations from which we do what we do. Believing that we are doing something new. But my question then would be, well, can't it be useful to have that point of departure, even if it may be problematic, so that we're not inventing in some kind of ideological void? And that may be what you were trying to say at the end. And so that perhaps by having, as problematic as they may be, the systems and cultures and technologies of music as they exist, may constrain us, but may give us the boundaries against which we try to overcome, and that perhaps some of those inventions of thought, whether they're epistemological or not, would be maybe accidental, and that they're emergent, happy accidents that happen in research that may be also happening at a theoretical level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think we do need a starting place. Yeah, and what I was saying at the end is, we can't succumb to a certain kind of nihilism where we can't write a single line of code because, well, what about all of these difficult questions? I think it's about responsibility and claiming responsibility for the decisions that we make. And I think that the problem with things like mapping is not that it's a bad or inferior technical practice. It's that the ideology happens in a place that people aren't looking for the ideology. And that as a result, I think there's too much kind of idealism about the kind of generality of the things that are being done, whereas it's okay not to be general. I think it's good to be very specific and to be very ideological, in fact, but just to take ownership for what that ideology is, where it comes from, and what alternatives might possibly exist. So that's I think, the starting point. Thanks for that.
Excellent, thank you. So if we can give them another round of applause. Thank you for the talk.